All right, hello. Welcome to the after party. We are here. We had a little tech difficulties there, getting started.
Yeah, I was waiting for the intro, and then I was like, oh,
and then it was just us.
Screen.
The music was introing, but it was just us sitting there watching the intro on the screen. So welcome. Hello, Ashley. Hello, Michael. How are you? Good to see everyone there. Well, welcome to the after party. I'm going to run through. I got to figure out what cameras are what here. There's Bobby.
Okay, yeah.
No. Is that Bobby? Yeah, that's Bobby. That's me. There's us. Excellent.
We're pretty interchangeable,
I know.
really.
We got the same haircut, basically.
I know.
Although mine's getting a little long, but other than that, basically, I just ask for the Bobby when I go in.
My hairstylist says, are you ready for your bobbing? The bob.
I just ask for, hey, Andy's here, Peter's here. Thanks, guys.
Nice,
Welcome.
nice.
I always ask, every time I go to the barber, he's like, what do you want? I'm like, shorter. What do you think I'm here for? I want my hair
I want to move my part
shorter than it used to be.
Yeah,
No, my part, it just like falls in the middle all the time. So as long as you cut it shorter.
You did have a
it's all good.
swoopy thing once, didn't you?
I think-
A little bit of a swoop, didn't you? There's a picture that sometimes surfaces
Yeah.
when you did some people's wedding. And it's a
If I swoop my hair, it looks like I'm balding and I'm trying to compensate for it.
Okay.
That's the problem there, right there.
ridiculous.
Look at that. That I'm looking at myself right now. That looks like I'm balding and compensating. So. Yeah, I've not had a lot of hairstyles over the years, but
There has been some variation. So,
there has been.
yeah,
Well,
I
welcome.
just-
How's everybody doing tonight? Not just you. Although we're gonna get to that, but I just mean, how's everybody
Jared
doing in the live
decided
stream?
Not to speak to me, just the comment.
It's gonna be a long hour here. Because-
well, we were talking about.
Exactly. I was gonna use.
Okay, go for it, pal. Go for it. Take it away.
No, I love. I knew 1999 Jeremy. He looked basically the same.
There it is.
1999 Jeremy. Come on. When I was 20 years old, how was that? I mean, I don't know how old I was then. Yeah, we were talking today because energy levels were pretty low around the office today.
Yeah,
Although they
sometimes,
perked up when I bought a pizza.
For Larissa.
Because Larissa wanted pizza. And it was half-price Domino's for lunch.
Even that, you didn't get as much
It's true.
traction on that. There was a little blip of energy.
And then it came down.
Yeah.
And I think
Low.
we were asking why.
Yeah.
I think it's the weather. Like, I think it's like fall has finally showed up.
Some of us had to scrape our cars this morning.
Yeah.
That was a reality.
And it's darker, right? Like it was dark when we came in to record this already.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well into the night.
So I think part of it is it just takes time to adjust to those changes, right?
Yeah.
Like it's okay. We'll be okay.
We'll all be okay. I also think, I was joking about this when I came in tonight, that like in lots of ways my life doesn't look so different.
Right.
Yeah. People may not know this about me, but I didn't have like a crazy social life or anything. I keep it pretty simple. But then I still think I'm absorbing or like processing some loss. So we just came through a long weekend.
Right.
And we work on Sundays, so long weekends are always kind of weird for us. But I don't know if other people also just like kind of skip Thanksgiving this year. Like, did you guys do anything? Did your family?
We actually did. We got together. I know. Normally we don't, but
Well, I feel less cool
we actually did
now.
see some friends and stuff. So I had some tofurkey.
Nice.
You know what's the funny thing? This is a side note, but Nancy messaged me, Nancy Bichet, who sometimes is here at the after party. I don't know if she's watching right now, but if she is, say hi. She was like, "Hey, how was your tofurkey for Thanksgiving?" Like joking with me. The funny thing is, we went to our friends. We ordered Indian and stuff, but they're like, when we were leaving, they're like, "Hey, do you want this?" And they pulled a tofurkey out of their freezer, and they're like, "We got this at the health food store as a like gift or something," and they're like, "We're not eating this weird thing." I'm like, "I'll take it. I'll try it." So,
Did you make it?
No, I haven't eaten it yet. I haven't
okay.
tried it. So, but I actually have a tofurkey in my freezer right now.
What to do with that in my brain?
Yeah.
What?
I don't even know what to do with it in my freezer. So, how's that for a setup? This is a side note.
It's just tofu?
No,
That's
so
shaped
here's the
like
thing.
a bird?
Tofurkey is a brand,
Oh.
right? And they used to sell like these tofu replacements for things.
Okay.
The problem is they're a big brand. They've been around for a long time, but the market has shifted. Like nobody eats like fake tofu
Right.
turkey anymore.
Right.
like there's new brands like Field Roast and stuff, and they're not trying to make fake meat. They're just making like a
thing you can eat.
Yeah, a loaf of thing that can be your, your centerpiece or whatever. Okay. So like Tofurky's like trying to rebrand. So you look at all their advertising, it says Tofurky really small, and then it's like plant-based.
Oh, okay, sure.
But it's just interesting to watch the way that like vegetarian food used to be a decade ago to what it's become now. Yeah. So anyway.
Okay.
Tofurky, I've never had it. I'll try it out. How did we get to that?
Energy levels.
Energy levels because of
I was trying to make the point that that we've come through a long weekend, that even I maybe would have like gone and seen some family. Yeah. And I didn't do that. Right. And it sort of feels like, is the loss of this time sort of present a little bit more emotionally coming through a long weekend? We're like, oh right, I haven't
you feel that a bit more
for months and months, or people who normally gather with a lot of people.
I personally,
I know,
and I know your partner probably feels the same way. Like, a lot of the pressure's off to just like be social.
Yeah.
So like, there's things I miss, but one of them is not the pressure to like hang out with people all the time. So that part I like. So
I know.
Ashley's joking here. She knew me when I was a youth pastor with Joe. So that was 2004. All right, Ashley, like
5 years.
Yeah, that was only 15 years ago. But 15 years ago, Jeremy was younger. I don't know what that means exactly.
And that's the wisdom and profundity that you came for tonight. That's
right.
it.
Welcome to the after party.
Yes. Low energy after party, but we're happy to be here. Yeah. Well, I can tell you something that I am excited about.
I would like to hear that. Yeah, let's hear it.
Halloween.
Are you a big Halloween person?
Oh my goodness.
Really?
Just yesterday.
How do I not know this about you?
I looked out the window and I said to Jonathan, I was like, oh my gosh, our neighbors are setting up more Halloween decorations. And he looked at me and did the same thing. He's like, every year I forget this about you.
That makes me feel a little better if your own husband was like, what?
My partner was like, this is so weird that you love it. I love Halloween. I'm a bit nostalgic for it. But I love it spiritually.
All right.
Like
you're gonna have to explain that. So.
Okay, so I almost forget how much I love it, and then I saw like a dangling hand and my like a limb, and then I went by another house when I was on a walk, and there was a skeleton just like looking out the window, and I giggled out loud. So what I love about Halloween is that we take the thing we're most afraid of, we put it on our front lawn, and we make a joke of it. Okay. I find it an incredible experience of a play with our fear. That you don't have, and it's connected to All Saints in terms of the liturgical calendar. So I get really excited about thinking about dead people, what they mean to me. I love Halloween. I love Halloween.
That's so funny sounding.
Okay. And I love the as the years go on, the gorier, grosser. I keep seeing this figure that's like a rotting mummy, and I giggle. I'm like,
I don't have any aversion to these things. I'm just so surprised that this is your thing.
It's maybe my favorite holiday.
It's very strange to me. Okay.
I love it.
We were out walking.
I'm curious about other people. Did people? I think a lot of people are like, oh, I hate it. It scares me. It scares my children.
I mean, there can be too much. I mean, we went for a walk with Eaton the other night through the neighborhood, and he loves it because he was all excited because there was a house it was funny. It was an older couple, but they happened to be sitting out on their deck, and they had decorated. But he didn't see them, and I noticed them. And as we're walking by, he's like, "Dad, that's amazing!" He's like, "They got a spider, and it's gone." And I could see them just they were both just old couple just sitting out there, just smiling, because he is oblivious to the fact they were sitting there, but was just enamored with these decorations as we walked by. So it's that probably made their night that they put in all this work.
I love it. Well, I grew up in a small town in Saskatchewan, and Halloween was this time when everybody comes out and you try to hit up all the houses in the village. Yeah. And then the next day on the school bus, you see what places got tricked. There'd be eggs on. It was just this really strange juxtaposition of trust and delinquency. But I love it.
So a couple comments here. Ashley saying my husband loves it. There we go. I don't get it.
Oh!
Was never allowed to go trick or treating. Oh, that's disappointing. So sorry about that.
I think you can recover.
But also, Michael, Sixth Sense movie is legitimately a really great movie. It's just so well constructed, and Anybody who tells me, they're like, oh, I saw it coming. I'm like, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
The first time you see it, you didn't see it coming.
Someone
it's
has
so
to write
well
it for you.
done.
But this is the thing about Halloween is like, I was just thinking about one memory I have of trick-or-treating as a kid. And I remember one of the households, the woman who I knew and like went to church, went to mass with, and rode the school bus with her kids. She opened the door all dressed like a really scary lady, and it freaked me out. But in the next moment, I laughed so hard, like that you can put those things side by side. You can be terrified and think you're going to lose your life, and then you can be like giggling hysterically with your friends, like, oh my gosh, that scared them.
There's a very big house in our neighborhood. I don't know what they're going to do this year. Now, obviously, they're quite wealthy, but they usually have like a food truck.
Okay.
And so, when you trick or treat, you go up and they decorate the whole place. They do a big maze, and you go through the maze, and then you get a ticket, and then you can use the ticket to go to the food truck to get like, whether it's empanadas or mini donuts or something like that, and they do it for the whole neighborhood. I mean,
let's just talk about that's cool. In another time, I'm not sure what Halloween will even look like.
Exactly.
In this time, but that people are out and walking up to each other's houses, that sort of like sense of like, I trust you, at least on this night. Do
you see what the city was talking about? Like doing these like candy shoots. They wanted people to buy like big PVC pipes. And you like put it on your thing. And then the people come out and you like lower your pipe into their bag and like fire a candy down, it goes into their bag or something like that.
This is my first year with like a house with a door.
Yeah. Are you in a neighborhood where you'll get a lot of kids?
Oh yeah, there are tons of kids in all.
So we're in a neighborhood where there's a ton of kids, but we're on a. By the way, that should sound better actually right now. Does that sound better, everyone? We're in a neighborhood where we're on a part of the street where the. Just not a lot of kids come to our house. But if we go out, then there's tons of kids around and stuff, so we see a lot of them. So I think I had the audio wrong, so that might sound a little better to everyone. I mean, you could hear us, obviously, because people were interacting with us. It wasn't turned off.
No one said anything, I don't think.
We'll see what they say. They're still adapting to how fantastic. Probably the volume just went way up, and they're like, I got to turn the volume down.
Okay.
Anyway.
What's happening?
All right. Wait, it got better. Weird. There we go. It sounded really echoey for a bit. Better now. There we go.
Great. Andy's always good to tell us what's up.
Yeah. You know what?
Halloween. I just wanted to talk about...
this far and we're still having tech problems, but...
Second season.
Yeah, second season. We're still figuring this out. Anyway, Halloween. I don't know. My son's been asking about it.
Yeah, what are you guys thinking of doing?
I don't know. I mean, part of it will depend on what it feels like as it gets closer.
Yeah, in terms of numbers.
In terms of the neighborhood, if people are out.
Yeah, I see more and more decorations every day, so I
Klossky's saying we sounded spooky because of the echo. So when we put this on the podcast, people are like, oh yeah, it's an effect we applied for the spooky conversation. Good. Don't worry about it. It's all good. So.
Oh gosh, I could just talk about Halloween forever. I think it's so cool and beautiful and gross all at the same time.
So why don't you, we got onto this already. Why don't you explain All Saints if people are listening that don't know about All Saints Day?
The Halloween is All Hallows Eve, the eve before All Saints. And it is, what historically is a day to remember the saints of the past and have some sort of liturgy around that.
But also, when we say saints, we mean that in the broader context. All Saints Day isn't just about sort of saints of the Catholic Church.
No, right.
It's about, saints who have been part of the Christian story and part of the body of Christ.
And unnamed,
that have passed and remembering that. Yeah. And I think it's one of those moments in the liturgical year, even after I sort of came to understand the beauty in that and we had adopted a lot of those traditions. It was one of the later ones in my life that I sort of realized, this is significant to remember this moment and to think about it.
I really love the emphasis that the Eastern Orthodox Church puts on your worship is always, you worship with the saints.
Right.
You sort of worship with those who've gone before you. That's a very real experience in the liturgy of the Orthodox Church. And I've always really enjoyed that in my imagination, and I think even in my spirituality. So,
and I know since we've incorporated that into some of our rhythms at Commons, it's been meaningful for people even to have that moment throughout the year that's not connected to necessarily like an anniversary of somebody's death, but that moment to remember that and to reflect on that, and it brings sad memories as well, but also that moment in the year to reflect and look back and understand, the beauty of what we lost and how we lean into that and all those types of things. So it's, personally, but then also as a community, it's become a significant piece.
I think that's a beautiful point, actually. When I lived in Vancouver in my last housing configuration, I lived with a family, so I lived in their attic, and I came and went.
This is why you love Halloween. It's because you lived in an attic for all those years.
I'm a ghoul.
You climbed out of the attic to scare the children. So
it was very spooky. But they actually incorporated All Saints liturgy into their family practice. So the night that the kids would go out trick-or-treating and in their costumes, we'd have dinner together. And I didn't always have dinner with them, but I had dinner with them on All Hallows Eve. And we would light a candle, and these children would take a moment to say and speak about someone that they've lost. Okay. So they had a grandmother, and a good family friend who had died. So it was always a part of their tradition that on this sort of spooky night where they go out and do some trick-or-treating, you also take a moment to remember those who have died. Okay. And it was beautiful, and they would weave in a little bit of the liturgy from Celtic daily prayer.
Interesting.
It was beautiful, and it was all kind of taking the liturgy of the community. Not that our community necessarily did something like that, but it's a larger Christian practice to remember the saints that have gone before you, and then to make it really personal in their family kind of liturgy. Not that they did a lot of those things.
Well, we got two more Tuesdays to talk about Halloween before big day.
Great.
So save it up. You can talk about Halloween next week. So
okay, that's great.
All right, sounds so much like Deo de los Muertos. What's the Pixar film?
Yeah, it's lovely.
About the little boy.
Somebody help us out.
That
it's sweet.
Coco.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good little movie. Cute little movie. So.
It is good.
Yeah. Today, for whatever reason, there's quite a delay on the comments coming in between the streams. So if it takes us a little bit to get back to comments, just give us a little grace. Yeah. It's there it is. Andy's with the Coco there.
Okay.
We'll get to him. Anyway, this is good, but we'll save some Halloween talk for later.
Great.
Well, maybe we'll do costumes.
Which is kind of funny because I hate dressing up.
The Tuesday before.
That's so good.
Remember when we did?
I actually really want a witch hat.
When we did staff costumes, maybe 2 years ago.
That's right.
On Tuesday, we made all the staff wear costumes to work.
Yeah, I did.
That was a good time.
Beach Bobby instead of Beach Barbie. Do you remember?
That's right. I don't even remember what I did. And Kevin had spooky games for us.
That was really fun.
Hilarious. It was fun. All right, where are we going tonight?
So good. Okay, so Scott preached on Sunday, which I always feel kind of funny that it's the two of us talking about someing else's sermon.
Every small group in our church does this. They talk about the sermons.
You always say that, and I'm like, you're right. That's right. But I still feel weird about it.
Talking about what we learned.
I mean, my experience of Scott's sermon was I kept kind of grabbing onto something he'd say, and I was like, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing. Right. And I'd want to just sit in that moment and think about it a little bit more.
Old man poet Scott. That's what we call him on staff.
That's what we call him. When he writes the prayers for the daily prayers, I'll be like, old man poet Scott.
Yeah. Although to be fair, everybody who writes those prayers are always they're mind blowing. They're every day I'm like, what? Again. I'm so impressed.
How'd you read them?
But you're right. We do call Scott old man poet Scott.
Does he know that? Probably not.
I don't know. He does now. He's now watching tonight, hopefully.
Now he's leading a marriage course.
Oh, that's right. Yes, marriage course is tonight also. So
right, the second night.
Absolutely.
Which is great. So I thought we could talk a little bit about it. I had a moment where I was like, yes, sermons are beautiful. Yeah. We value that in our voice here. And I thought we could just talk about why should a sermon be beautiful, and then talk about some of the things that were beautiful in Scott's message.
Which is a really interesting conversation.
Yeah. Way to set it up. So prepare yourself. It's going to be so interesting.
It's not going to be like our other conversations, our uninteresting ones. No, but I think the idea of so I don't know.
Wait, what is a sermon for?
Yeah.
Why would it need to be beautiful?
So you grew up in a number of different traditions.
I know I have.
But where would you say most of your theological training was situated in terms of tradition? You went to Regent.
Yeah, I went to Regent. Yeah.
And why I ask that is because there's a section of sort of Protestant Christianity that thinks of the sermon as information dissemination, right? That what a sermon is about is good theology.
Yes, right.
So you dissect the text, you try your best to get this sort of clear, unbiased, untainted, interpretive exegesis of the scripture, and then you communicate that to people.
Right.
And if you happen to be a good communicator, great.
Right.
But really, the point of a sermon
is
to exegete this and get it across.
Yes, I see.
And that's a type, that is in my undergrad, that's the sort of homiletics that I really learned about. And I learned about, you can have a hook and you can have a little...
book look.
That's right. I remember learning that. But at the end of the day, the whole concept of a sermon was still... come up with some timeless truth that's untainted by you as a human person and communicate that as clearly as possible. And somewhere over the years, my concept of what a sermon has changed.
Yeah.
I'm interested, as we talk about beauty, and we'll talk about why in a moment, have you moved in terms of your thinking about a sermon?
I think that was certainly how homiletics was taught to me. That very Protestant, you're choosing a text, you're doing your study, you're making 3 points with each of your sections. This is your kind of big God idea. But the things that really made me interested in homiletics were these moments when I think back in my theological training when people spoke about preaching as something poetic.
Right.
And Walter Brueggemann's Finally Comes the Poet was such an influential book that was a voice rising up from these this is how you dissect the thing and then put it in front of the people and they fill in the blanks on the page and and then there was Brueggemann's it must be beautiful or it will reduce the profound experience of a community coming together around a sacred text, considering what was ancient for our current moment. Because
I remember early in my, and again, in seminary it was different, but in my undergrad, my undergrad is in theology as well, but it was that idea that you don't want too much of your personality or performance to come through. You want to point people to the scriptures, which is true in a sense, but there's almost this sort of push back against the idea of performance as a part of a sermon.
Right.
Now it's funny because you look at some of those sort of really rigid, conservative, fundamentalist expressions of preaching, and they are all about performative voice, performative language, and all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't named, and that was almost seen as a negative. And over the years, the more I started actually preaching to people, to audiences, and then hearing back from them what was happening in them as I preached, I began to realize, that the pure information that I'm trying to communicate is not what is actually impacting people. And it's not actually even the thing that people are taking away from it.
Yes.
Right? I thought I was saying this, they heard this other thing. And then I started to understand that, actually, maybe that's actually the point, is that the Spirit is doing something in someone as you speak. Yeah. And then I not just realized that, but then I began to lean into that piece and say, so it is a performance because you're drawing something out of people. Now, it's not a stand-up comedy routine. Yeah. You're trying to communicate something of God, but if anything, you're trying to invite people into your experience of God more than some pure antiseptic objective experience of God that doesn't really exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it doesn't exist because it always comes through a person.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about. I hadn't thought about this question of beauty in preaching in terms of where I picked it up on, where that value came from for me. But I remember these moments again, sort of speaking. I remember Maxine Hancock, who was one of the professors at Regent, she also did a lot of teaching around literature and spiritual memoirs and things like that, which I love. So I remember the lecture where it was just, those moments that are just kind of vibrating with something really important for you. And she was we need the poets, like we need the storytellers,
Right.
you know, in our pulpits. And it was one of those moments where I was like, I felt, you know, my heart strangely warmed in such an important way. So, and then I think what has moved me, or what has really shaped me, what has been like a lot of beauty, a lot of things said beautifully or carefully. So I think I've always liked words, and I like the care with words. So I've enjoyed that.
I want to continue this,
Yeah.
but it does remind me, I've been reading a lot of James Cone over the last couple of months. But one of the things that Cone brings to his theology is this idea that there's no such thing as a disembodied theology. So nobody reads scripture from a point of neutrality. We're always reading through lenses. But in his particular awareness as a Black theologian, part of what he's writing about is this idea that any theologian, any preacher who claims to speak in a neutral way is, again, he's talking in a particular context of America, but he's saying that's inherently racist because it's assuming the neutrality of you and your starting point. Now in America, that tends to be white, and it does too in Canada as well. But his larger truth in that is that anytime we assume that our reading is neutral, that it's untainted by anything around us, and that it is true in and of itself, we're necessarily excluding all of the voices around
really
us.
Suspicious of.
And also, but here's what I was going to say, I'm preaching, we're excluding all the voices of the people in our audiences that are listening to us, right? So if we get up and we say, this is a neutral, completely unbiased reading, we're necessarily excluding all of those voices in our communities that are adding to the conversation in their own way in their own head right now. And so finding ways to preach that lean more into the poetic that brings it out of you rather than always a didactic that almost closes down what's happening inside of you becomes really important. And again, I'm reading him specifically because I want to read, a Black theologian, and I want to hear the critiques of, white culture and white supremacy in my own voice. Yeah. But when I apply it to this conversation, it's even that much more true. Yeah. That if I teach in a way that doesn't allow your voice as the listener to still remain speaking in your head, right, then I've stolen something from you in my preaching rather than gifted something to you. Right. And that's been. I think I've understood that for a number of years now, but his language brought it out in a new way for me, which was kind of neat. So. Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, it's some of the things I love about Brueggemann's language around the poetry is the moving away from that which reduces. So I like this idea that your story is a part of this. This conversation.
There's a comment here. I was talking about expository or topical sermons. And just so everybody sort of understands some of those terms, generally, what we tend to do at Commons is expository. And by that, what we mean is we will take a passage of Scripture or a series of passages like we're doing in this Strange Exchange series. So it's like we're taking questions, but we're coming to those stories of Jesus' questions and we're saying, well, what's going on here in this story, right? Like the point of the sermon is not to say anything in particular. It's to say, what is this story telling us? I would say that's probably 70%, 75% of our year. When we do Jonah, it's like we're going to try to talk about what Jonah is saying to us. Topical is what we do with things like Swipe Right. Yeah. We're talking about human sexuality. And then we'll sort of sift through the scriptures and say, okay, what do the scriptures say about this topic? Right. And we do that. It's important. We're going to do forgiveness in the new year. Yeah. That's topical.
That's also how we approach the text with our lives.
Exactly.
I'm wondering about this. Yeah. So I think modeling that is important as well.
But generally, I think the majority of what we do is expository because, and let's be honest here, it's just easier. Don't you find? Maybe you're different, but I find expository easier. I'm like, give me a text. Let me do some research. Let me talk about it. Topical is always hard for me.
I'm not going to say one's easier than the other.
Non-committal.
I'm always wrestling.
Bobby can do a topical sermon on
for not
commitment.
Fighting all of it.
I hear you.
Yeah, I was looking through Brueggemann's work again before I drove over, and this will kind of lead us to some of Scott's stuff. But one of the things he had written, and Finally Comes the Poet, is the artful drama of hurt healed requires an artful voice that stands shrewdly against the voices that either make guilt our fate or that offer healing too soon and too cheaply. I was just like, I'd turn the page and see another underlined bit, and it was just, reading Brueggemann is beautiful.
Yeah.
Often. So thinking about Scott's message, he was dealing with the question, do you still not see or understand? What do you think he was doing with that question?
I thought it was a really interesting sermon because it was a really difficult text in some ways, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, one of the lines that we were talking about was his, what was the one we talked about? About the way that Jesus speaks to the disciples there.
The groan?
The groan, yeah.
Okay.
The groan. What was his line?
The groan.
Yeah.
Well, Scott took the word. Do you remember what it was?
I don't remember the Greek word.
Yeah. I have it written, but I don't even want to say it because I'm probably getting it wrong. But Jesus's groan cuts off the question. So the Pharisees come at Jesus, and then it says he groaned.
He groans, yeah.
Yeah, with like.
And Scott had this very sort of generous, beautiful explanation of that.
Yeah.
But I think it's a difficult text because he kind of groans, like in some ways it feels like a big eye roll to the Pharisees.
Right. Scott would say that, yeah.
Yeah, and then but then the next thing is he's talking to his disciples, and they're like, oh, you know, and then he talks about the yeast to the Pharisees, and they're like, oh, it's because we forgot to bread the bread, and he's like, oh, do you still not understand? Like, it can come off as this very sort of passive-aggressive Jesus, right?
Yeah.
You know, like he rolls his eyes at the Pharisees and he's like, oh, you guys, are you still so dull?
Right.
You know, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, why don't you understand yet?
Yeah, like,
just like you do to me all the time.
Yeah, my son, when I try to tell him something, come on, Dad. But Scott had this, I think, you know, what he did in the end of it was this, what I took away from it anyway, was you have to read that moment of Jesus asking them, do they still not understand, in the larger context of his continuing relationship with them. So do you still not understand is not the end of the conversation. In fact, it's actually in the middle of the conversation because he's not so fed up that he stops explaining to them. Like, and even if you take the worst possible, like the least generous explanation for Jesus in that moment, right?
Yeah.
Then maybe he is fed up. Maybe he's like, I'm done with you guys for right now.
Yeah.
The beauty is that's not the end of the conversation because he does come back and he does keep teaching them until they understand with his words, with his actions, with his death, with his resurrection. And I actually, strangely, because of the way Scott framed it, took a lot of comfort out of that to go, oh, so even if Jesus is a little fed up with me today, maybe that's okay.
Right.
Because that doesn't mean he's done with me.
He didn't shut it down.
Yeah.
Yeah, he
like,
didn't walk away.
Like, are there moments where Jesus rolls his eyes at me? I mean, probably, right? And yet now from this story, I have this perspective that reminds me, oh, but that's okay. It's not okay. Like, I don't want to make Jesus frustrated. But I can be confident that even if he is, that doesn't mean the end of it. Like, he'll be there tomorrow, ready to work all over again.
Right.
Like, even if I'm so terrible one day, he's like, I'm done for the day. I'm going to bed. You're on your own. I'll see you tomorrow. At least tomorrow, he'll be back. And that's really the biggest thing I took away from Scott's sermon was read this moment in the context of this larger relationship, which I thought was really beautiful.
Yeah, that is beautiful.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. I loved some of Scott's language around, I love this idea that Jesus was profoundly curious about Jesus's world. Yeah. Like that, just to like remember, oh, right, we're in a series of questions and that it wasn't this, he didn't seem to live as one who already knew all the answers, so why bother asking? Yeah. So I just enjoy. Again, I was like, hold up! I just want to think about that some more.
And I think this is it's one of my main hopes with this series, is in seeing all the ways that Scott and you and I are able to sort of relook at these questions, is to move people away from the assumption that this is just rhetorical for Jesus.
Yeah.
Because I think I think that's how I think sometimes. I'm
Yeah,
like, if
we
Jesus is
all
asking a
do.
question,
Yeah.
it's because he's trying to get somewhere.
Right.
And and sometimes I don't have this appreciation of Jesus just being curious and asking a question because he wants to know the answer.
Right.
Or he wants to provide opportunity for someone to speak.
To reflect, yeah.
You know, like, and sometimes the way the questions are worded are so pithy, like, do you still not understand? Like, that feels like it's not a genuine question. It's a rhetorical moment. And I think
can you imagine if we were like that in our relationships? Like I was just always using rhetoric to make my point
well,
and
I
not
do that,
care about, just think about our families.
It's true, right?
Like not at all interested in what you actually bring as yourself to this complicated world that we live in. And
it very much sort of takes the humanity out of Jesus and the humanity out of these conversations. So putting them back in these contexts where, Jesus is a little frustrated right here, but still in the context of relationship. And when Jesus asks something, you know, he cares about that answer. He cares about that conversation. That has been, like, if anything, that opens up the stories just on its own. Just if you take that view.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes. Yeah.
And you stop trying to get to what does Jesus, what's his goal here? What's his ulterior motive?
Totally.
You know, and you just read it for what it is.
Yeah.
What would this conversation be about?
Right.
So I hope people
that's nice.
Can do that even in their own reading through this series, in these conversations. But I mean, I think
I just wonder how long it takes us to undo those layers of what we are reading on the words. Like I'm kind of, even reading through the story today, it was hard for me to kind of push aside this sort of snarky question. You know, like, why don't you understand, idiot? Rather than like, I love you. Okay, let's do this.
Because and so even your language there, like, isn't it like we want a Jesus whose his love is always sort of gentle, but isn't there something profoundly loving about a Jesus who's just frustrated with our inability to grasp something and still says, I am so frustrated right now, but I will not give up, and I'll be back at this in the morning. Like, isn't that a deep expression of love? And Ashley said, you know, here, resonating so much as a mom of a toddler, so many groans, no decrease in love. Like, that kind of parental, motherly love that says, you are driving me nuts right now, Bobby, but I will be here tomorrow.
Totally.
Like, in some ways, that feels more true and more honest expression of love than a Jesus who's always just like, oh, this is great.
Like an actually love you can trust.
Because I'm not always easy to love, even for God, right? Like, God does, because God is love. But that doesn't always mean, you know, we're equally, you know, ready to accept and receive.
Reciprocating
exactly. And so a God who sticks with us even when we're less than simple to love. I'm like, that's actually like a strangely, profoundly beautiful image, you know? When my son is driving me nuts.
It is,
and I'm like, you got to go to bed.
Yeah.
But of course I still love him.
Right. Yeah, I think about my mom's like love for me as this like incredible, consistent thing. And I often think of myself as just like, I'm an okay daughter. Like, I'm okay. As one of the roles in my life that I'm just okay at. I'm not an incredible daughter. And every time, you know, I call her, she's like, hey, sweetie. She's just always so good. And then I think she must just, like, I frustrate her. I don't call her.
How did you and I end up with, like, great parents like this? Because that's exactly the same as my parents.
She's so good. And I feel like when she hangs up the phone, I'm sure she still, like, loves me so much, but also, like, that woman.
I'm just like so caught up in my own stuff, my own goals, my own work all the time.
I know.
Oh, wow. All right, what else you got? What else was beautiful for you?
What else was beautiful? Well, should we talk a bit about subtext? Scott was doing some things with subtext in this sermon. And I mean, I want to get to this question that Yelena asked her groups, kind of as a way to wrap up. I mean, we're at 8:40 already, so. But do we want to say a little bit about what Scott was doing with subtext? He used Fight Club as a reference in the Starbucks cup, which I'd seen Fight Club and read the book, but I don't remember any of that.
I mean, the idea, for Scott was just this idea that the conversation about bread and yeast. So the yeast comes out of the conversation of bread, and the bread comes out of the conversation of Jesus feeding this crowd with bread.
Right.
So in some sense, there's this theme that Mark is creating here that's leading to this kind of encounter, right?
It was this part of what Scott was saying about it's not always like the words that Jesus is saying, but it's also like the places he goes. It's like all
the
these
stuff
little
that's
things,
hidden in behind.
All these,
right. So the random phrase, be careful for the yeast of bad teaching, is not just a random thing. It ties in. If you've got him talking about yeast of bad teaching here, and you've got him demonstrating good teaching as he makes bread and gives it to people, you're talking about a contrast there. Bad teaching is just ideas that go in your head. Good teaching is generous and kind and shares. But that's not there in the text of the story.
Right.
That's there in the contrast because bread is throughout the whole narrative, which I think is a really interesting concept. And the way that a physical appearance of bread is now contrasted with a teaching point about yeast and bread, and how those are meant to interact with each other.
Right.
His illustration was Fight Club. There's always a Starbucks cup, because it's a commentary on consumerism.
Yeah.
So
which
how
is this
do we
beat to the whole film? Yeah, it's like these are really unhappy people who are, or I don't know.
Are buying things and it's not helping them.
Yeah, it's not helping them.
So the interesting thing then for Scripture is how do you read in ways that's aware of those things below the surface, and that reminds you that when Jesus is talking about yeast, let me take a look. If he's talking about yeast of bad teaching, is there examples that have to do with bread and yeast that show me a counterpoint? I mean, that's a sophisticated way to read.
Right.
But I think Scott is absolutely right that it's clearly sort of an intended part of this narrative structure, the way it's been put together. And, and that's what we call subtext, which I think was a, really profound sort of insight into it.
So one of the things that Yelena asked groups this week was what's been showing up for you again and again in your life, which was a really great question.
Right, yeah, because what's the subtext of your life?
Exactly. So. And she had her own story that she shared about just these profound moments in her life that she looks back and thinks, this has been subtext and quite directive. Yeah. What comes to your mind when you think about
It's a good question.
something like that's been really sort of directive or like a consistent theme of... Yeah, I love the question. I love the question,
and I'm struggling to sort of answer right now. And I mean, I think sometimes that's just honesty. Is we don't always have those recurring themes. I think that is one of the ways that Spirit speaks to us. Yeah, is you notice things over and over again. And to be fair, we talked about this before we went on air. Yeah. And so I've had time, and yet I still haven't sort of come up with that. Right. What's that beat that's recurring for me right now? Right. I mean, I'm kind of getting caught up in back to the beginning, the Halloween stuff of it. There's always this kind of teachable thing for me at this time of year that I'm I almost forget how much I love it. And then I'm all right, I love this. There's something for me to pay attention to and my delight in it. Yeah. I was thinking about those things sitting side by side as I was thinking about why should sermons be beautiful. And then I got thinking about humor and what there's sometimes humor is quite beautiful. It can be wow, that joke was put together so beautifully and masterfully. It can also be kind of grotesque if it takes down someone or is at the expense of someone. Anyways, so I was thinking about what is some of this subtext of beauty is such an interesting value for me. But so I'm kind of interested in the grotesque as well, and that one kind of brings out the other. You're kind of creeped out. No, I think it's interesting.
But any.
I don't have a great answer for that right now. I mean, I've been reading themes. Because I've been reading sort of similar authors. I mentioned James Cone. I'm reading that right now. Right. I've also been reading James Baldwin, which is, he's Cone is a great theologian. Baldwin, who's another, I don't know if you'd call him a theologian.
He just talks about all things.
But about race and about being black in America and stuff. But very poetic writer and stuff. So those are themes, but those are themes that I've sought out to try to sort of expand my awareness around some things, particularly in this season. Yeah. So those are themes that are sort of reoccurring in my reading,
Right.
but not necessarily things that are popping up in the background in the subtext.
Right. Yeah.
I'd have to give that more thought. And I think this is sort of part of Scott's point, is that subtext is hard to notice.
Yeah, that's right. It's like, it's the small stuff. Yeah, both the good small stuff and the negative small stuff.
Yeah, and you have to sort of be exegeting
Yeah.
your world all the time to know those things that are coming up over and over again.
Right. Yeah, what does Scott say? Pay attention to the small things as the biggest step in our journey toward wholeness.
Yeah.
Wow.
There's an interesting conversation going in the comments here.
Oh, yeah.
You know, that we're talking about autism and, neurodivergence and what it means, in terms of relationships, being loved, being difficult to be loved, all these types of things. But when you talk about subtext, I think this is one of those interesting pieces because we have certain subtext that we've adopted in our view of ourselves and the view of people around us in terms of what's neurotypical, therefore what's easier or less easy to love, because we've gotten used to certain things. Like now, neurotypical is the subtext, right? So now anybody who's different than that, thinks differently, reacts differently, has different sort of, emotional capacities, they stand out and they sort of rise to the surface. And then we either back away or we lean towards, all those different types of things. But understanding the ways that subtext can also make us aware of difference in our midst, and the ways that subtext, what's normal to us, quote unquote, can make us less ready to embrace those who are different, those who experience the world differently. So subtext can be this beautiful thing of this thing that keeps popping up. How do we become aware of that? How do we notice that? Subtext can also be the thing that steals from us the beauty of anything that's different, because it's different and it looks scary and we set it aside. Yeah. And so maybe sometimes, subtext becomes sort of the ground around us, and when some things pop up, we notice those things as well. And we learn new ways, to embrace people. We learn new ways to welcome people into community, all that, which can be another way that subtext sort of, in and of itself, it doesn't help or hinder us, but it's something to be aware of all the time. And again, going back to Cone, there's a subtext of what I think is neutral when I read the Bible, but that's because I'm a white, straight man, and so how am I aware of difference? How does that, how do I allow that to speak to me? How do I learn from somebody who's, neuroatypical? How do I learn from someone who's a woman? How do I learn from all these stories and incorporate them in and not let the subtext of what's normal to me in the way I view my world dominate everything around me?
It makes me think about our conversation last week around scholarship and like finding, because I just get so frustrated when I go looking for voices and they all come to me from like white guys in certain parts of the West.
They're Germans. If they were written in the 20th century, they're Germans. That's where all the good theology came from.
It has made me, does anybody else think that this is wild, that these are the only voices that really are shaping like our take on these texts? This is great.
And, to some of the point we've been talking about is as soon as you, as an author or a theologian, as soon as you name that, well, then great. Now we can have a conversation about that. But when you're so steeped
that you don't even know
in your subtext that you don't know that you're a white male theologian, you just think you're doing pure theology. That's the problem. When you say, this is my context, this is where I'm coming from, this is my prolegomena, this is how I see the world, and this is how I'm doing theology, then that can be set up against, the theology of James Cone. And you can say, this is why we read differently, and this is why these different perspectives are important. But when it's just the context isn't named, then the context becomes subtext to the theology that's being written. And when that subtext doesn't get acknowledged, that's when it actually becomes, in the context of white, European, it becomes white supremacist, because it's like, that's now the default. And if you're a black theologian, you have to prove why your theology should be considered at the table. Or if you're a woman, you have to prove why your perspective should be at the table. They're like, wrong with white men doing theology. That's not the point of all this woke conversation. The point is realizing that white men doing theology are not the only people doing theology. And their voice, should have a seat at the table. but it shouldn't be the table.
It shouldn't be the table.
You know, and that's the problem.
Sort of feels
is because once it becomes the table, everyone else has to sort of fight for their voice there.
Yeah.
And I think this is what you were talking about last week, you know, in terms of scholarship and part of where we ended up today.
Yeah.
On some of these things. But.
Yeah. Well, what are you grateful for?
Grateful for, it's 8:50 already.
Yep, I'm wrapping this up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, you know, out of the conversation today, I don't know if I would have started here on this, but I am grateful for, first of all, the awareness that I've come to seek out some of those other voices in my life and to be deeply influenced and reshaped by that theology that I'm reading. I'm thankful for the ways that then plays into the way that I preach, that I, you know, back to where we've been talking about, I don't try to preach in ways that tell you what the scripture is about. I'm trying to find ways that honor your voice in your head as you read. And I'm trying to do that in a beautiful way that draws something out of you. And I'm thankful for the way that feeds back into how I read theology and how I become fascinated again with the text all over again. Because I do.
That's how it's living.
Yeah, I do find myself still at this point, 20 years into my career, fascinated with the Bible and fascinated with Jesus. And I think Jesus still has so much to speak to us and teach to us. And all of this new, you know, awareness and reading and perspective only makes all of that more beautiful to me. So in the light of this conversation, that's certainly something that I'm very grateful for, because I want to do this job for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, and that means it needs to be interesting to me for a long time. So what are you grateful for? Halloween. I was gonna say that. So I was like,
I keep going back to something Peter said in the comments. I find it easy to learn. It's hard to unlearn / relearn.
Oh man, that's a great comment and so true.
I know. I think sometimes that's what's keeping me always interested is that I'm still like, there are so many things I want to unlearn about the divine and the ways that we speak and experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's so back to where we started. I mean, did we talk about the 666 video? I don't know.
No, we haven't. We did earlier.
If you're on there, I put on a video about 666 and where that comes from and stuff.
Yeah.
But, you know, where it came from was, somebody sent me a sermon about this pastor who's like, as we all know, you know, the current events are leading to, you know, the one world government and the Antichrist. And I'm like, what do you mean we all know that? I'm like, that's a very modern niche interpretation within a sect of evangelical Christianity.
Right.
Most Christians do not hold that kind of view of Revelation. But it's exactly that. It's like once you've learned something, like this is what this passage means. Yeah. It can be very disorienting and very hard to come back and hear things in a new way. Yeah. And I think you hope this too. One of the things that we do at Commons is try to help people read things in a new way. Yeah. Not for the novelty of it. Right. But just to recognize there are layers and there are perspectives and there is so much more beauty here to mine in these scriptures. Right. And you can do the same story over and over. I'm doing the Good Samaritan on Sunday. You know, but I'm going to focus on it in a totally different way, looking at the question that leads into it, not the question that leads out of it. Right. All of a sudden this week, I was like, okay, totally new perspective on this story.
And the fact that we bring different voices to the text, like we just dialogued with Scott's voice tonight, also is this example of, you know, what you're saying.
So, sorry, this was You're Grateful, but I think it's really profound to talk about the beauty of unlearning something. I think it's just so important.
Yeah, it is really, it's hard work, but it's beautiful.
Yeah. So what are you unlearning?
Oh gosh, everything. Like no, it's fine. I love Halloween. Let's carry on.
Hilarious. Okay. What are we at? We're at 8:54? Yeah. You got anything else on your agenda?
I don't. Okay. No, I don't think I do.
This was our lowest energy after party, I think.
We did okay.
No, but I mean, like, it was like a nice, like, calm conversation. Well, we weren't hysterically laughing. No feet got into the shot.
I know, thank.
So it was good.
Thank the saints.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, always nice. Always nice.